Hi, this is Stan Bush.
Hi, this is Stephanie Calvert.
This is John Payne.
This is Jack Hughes.
Hey everyone, this is Britt Lightning from Vixen.
Hey everybody, this is Prescott Niles.
Hi, I'm Carrie Stevens.
Hello, I'm Kofi Baker.
You're listening to Play That Rock and Roll.
This is not a test. This is Play That Rock and Roll. I'm your host, Joe Kay, and today our guest is music critic and historian Gary Graff. Gary is the editor of the new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, the Music Fan's Definitive Guide. Gary recruited several music writers to work with him on this project, and the end result is a year-by-year list of the most important albums that were released in the 1990s. This book gave us a great topic for today's podcast, but it was actually another book of Gary's that made me seek him out for the show. Now, earlier this year, I visited Detroit. And while I was there, I went to see an exhibit at the Detroit Historical Museum. That exhibit was made up of selections from photographer Tom Weschler's archive of photos from his time working as Bob Seger's road manager back in the early days of Bob's career. I loved the exhibit, so when I discovered a book that contained even more of these photos, I immediately picked up a copy from the gift shop. It's called TRAVELIN Man, On the Road and Behind the Scenes with Bob Seger. And Gary is the co-author, which makes sense given that Detroit music history is one of his areas of expertise. So in this interview, we discuss both books. First, we talk about how the 90s book came to be and what makes the albums included there essential. Gary also expands on a couple of the classic rock albums that he wrote the reviews for, specifically albums from the Eagles, Meat Loaf, John Fogerty, and even the Trans-Siberian Orchestra. The second part of this interview is about Bob Seger. We talk about how TRAVELIN Man was put together and what makes this era of Bob's career so special. We also discuss why Bob did not make the cut for the 90s book, his rather old-school approach to the music business, and Gary also shares some of his favorite memories of seeing Bob in concert. Both of these are available wherever books are sold. But before going to Amazon, please consider first checking your local independent bookstore. Or, if you're in the Detroit area, for TRAVELIN Man, do what I did. Go to the Detroit Historical Museum, check out the exhibit there, and then get yourself a copy from the gift shop. Also, be sure to find Gary on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Social media is actually the best way to keep up with Gary's music articles and concert reviews, which are written for multiple publications. Links are in the description below. And finally, if you're in the Milwaukee area, like me, you can hear Gary's weekly radio appearance on Bob and Brian in the Morning on 102.9 The Hog for his segment Music News, which airs on Friday mornings. And with that, here's my conversation with the editor of the new book, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, Gary Graff.
I got a hot rod heart. Traveling man, love when I can.
You have a segment on Bob and Brian's show here in Milwaukee, and it synced up perfectly with my commute on Fridays back when I was in school. And that was a little before everything was on the internet, so I remember really loving that segment because as a young music nerd, that was how I got my info about what was going on in the industry.
Thank you for mummifying me with the timetable on that.
Yeah, hey, listen, I'm not quite there with you, but it's been a while for me too. But I will say I feel like opening this segment by saying long-time listener, first-time caller.
There you go. Well, thanks for listening. Those guys, it's been I've been on there a long time now, and those guys are a riot. It's one of the best parts of my week is Friday morning. getting ready to be on with them.
Yeah. How long have you been doing that show now?
So I'd have to go, I should have a ready answer for this, but it does go back to the Bush 2 presidency. I remember this just because it was happening.
Yeah.
The Bush 2 presidency and the war
Yeah.
was right about the time. It was when the Dixie Chicks went off in London. So that's how we can date it. It was that same month, because that happened like our third episode.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's funny.
So yeah, so that's got to be like around 92, 93.
Yeah, man. That goes back. Wait, you said the second, well, with the Dixie
Bush
Chicks.
2.
Yeah.
Bush
Okay,
2,
so Iraq War. I think that's like 2003, 2004.
I probably, yes.
Okay,
probably. My head is so in the 90s right now that I'm getting my decades all messed up.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we're definitely I have tons of 90s questions for you, but I also want to let you know that I was in Detroit earlier this year, your neck of the woods, and I went to the
And you didn't call?
No, I didn't. No, it was my second time there. I love Detroit. I had a great time both times I was there, but this time I wanted to make a point to see like a Bob Seger thing. So I found out that your co-author on this book, Traveling Man, Tom Weschler, had an exhibit at the Detroit Historical Museum. Went over there and got this in the gift shop, and that's my souvenir of Detroit for this year.
Oh, well, thank you. You're the other one who bought it. That's
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that was a fun project as well.
Oh, good. I have a couple of questions about that too, but
Sure.
let's first start with the '90s book, because that's your most recent. Here's another quantitative question for you that maybe you don't have offhand, but how many books is this for you at this point?
It's about 12, depending how we count.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's been about 12. I started actually with another kind of record guide series called Music Hound that I did with a local press, and then went on to do books like the Seger book and books about Springsteen and Neil Young and rock and roll myths and Alice Cooper just before this.
Well, between these books and your columns, I mean, do you subscribe to the Stephen King philosophy on how much to write a day? That your hands just must be destroyed.
Yeah, I don't. Well, I work out and
Okay,
make sure the hands get included. I don't have a set. No, I'm kind of like a cook to order. When I have deadlines and I have assignments, then I work on them, and if I don't make work for myself. Of course, if I don't, that means I'm frantically searching for work. So
very good. Yeah, well, I'll tell you that after reading, through both of these, I definitely want to read more of your catalog, because I even though I haven't listened to you on the radio in a while, I have been reading your columns, and I love it because a lot of the concerts that you see in Detroit, a lot of those tours come through Milwaukee, and
right.
Sometimes I make a decision on if I go to that show or not based on your recommendations. So highly recommend the columns. But let's talk about the '90s book. You have like a small army of contributors for this, because this was a big project.
Yeah.
So let's talk about them a little bit. How did you assemble this crew, and what made you trust their instincts and opinions to include here?
Well, it was all people who'd work for cheap. That was the main criteria. Now, I did tell them all. I said, I can basically pay you beer money. It'll be craft beer money, but beer money. But seriously, I mean, these are all friends, colleagues, associates who pleased to report are still friends, colleagues, and associates after they saw how I edited their entries. And it was just folks I knew who could do this, who could do the job, who would have the authoritative perspective to really do the right job on these albums, and also who had expertise. Like I sought out Carl Phillips is my gospel guy. Charlie Hunt is one of my jazz guys. Mike Himes and Clark Warner are, those guys were on the ground floor of the techno explosion.
Okay.
So I knew that. I was surprised by some of my people, like the guys I work with on the ultimateclassicrock.com website. They wanted a bunch of hip hop albums. And I was like, really? But it made sense, because they're of the age, they grew up with hip hop. as well as with classic rock. So it was fun. I mean, you get to work with your friends, you get to work with people you value, and have discussion. Basically have discussions we'd be having anyway, except now it's for something in particular. One of the funniest things that happened during the process was several of these, the majority of the writers are from here in Detroit.
Okay.
Several of these, I would be at a concert, all of us covering them together. And for a good solid month, we'd be talking about the book and and having, what would best be described as passionate discussions about what should and shouldn't be in the book, to the point where other people around us were calling security, thinking we were going to start swinging at each other or something. But yeah, that was a real pleasure to be able to work with all those people. And we've done one event here in Detroit where I had 14 of us together.
Oh wow!
And we had a really good time being together and representing the book like that.
Yeah, that just sounds great. I mean, hey, you could make a bowling league out of it.
A little bit. Actually, all of my golf, the guys I golf with every weekend wrote for the book.
Oh, that's great, yeah. I gotta compliment the selection, because I don't think any fair read of this book could possibly accuse anybody of it skewing towards one genre or another. Like, it really did feel like almost a statistical overlook of every genre that was big in that era, including some that weren't.
We knew we needed to represent the totality of the era, save perhaps for classical, and there is a Yo-Yo Ma album in here, and it really, we didn't say it's got to be X percentage this or that. It was just being conscious of, okay, are we, and that word essential is so key to the whole thing, is, are we getting the right albums, the essential albums, and what do those include? So we didn't leave anything out because we needed more hip hop or gospel or EDM. We just used that as a guide point to assemble the list.
Well, it's a bold claim, but like, when you take that approach, it lives up to it.
Right.
So my question, let's give some honorable mentions here, because I've heard you say that you had to make some very painful cuts. Just off the top of your head, what are some of the first things that come to mind that didn't make the book that you wish there was maybe a little more room for?
Oh, nothing. These are the 501.
Okay.
Period. And I'm going to stand by that.
Okay.
We have to say these are, yes, we made some painful decisions, and it's funny when you first do it, 501 sounds like a big number. Like, oh, are we really going to be able to get that many? And then when you've made the long list of 2,300 that you have to pare it down to, but no, I have to plant my flag on these 501s and say there's nothing else that we'd put. There's nothing we're lamenting.
Okay, that's fair. Okay, well, maybe I'll go with this approach. On the flip side, what do you remember being the easiest to push off the table?
Well, and those wouldn't even have necessarily made the long list.
Okay.
There was a lot of junky pop, obviously, that came out from that decade. You got to remember, the first thing I wrote, or the first thing you read in this book, is this is a book that's designed to cause arguments.
Yeah.
So, I'm hoping people will say, there's no Creed in here. And that's right. There's no Creed in here. Why would there be?
Yeah.
And
Michael Bolton.
There's no Michael Bolton. Why would there be? There are some very interesting, I don't call them omissions, but choices not to include. There are some very important artists. Jackson Browne, James Taylor, Joni Mitchell, AC/DC, Rush. They don't have anything in this book. Why? Because when we looked at their output during the 90s, they all released some very good albums, but they weren't essential albums to their own catalogs, much less to the decade. Ergo, not in the book. Now, that's going to be a different situation in the 80s, which is coming out in May. And in the 70s, when we greenlight that book, obviously, so I think all of the essential artists will get their due over the course of the series. but not necessarily, we weren't going to have a James Taylor or Joni Mitchell in this book just because they're important artists. The albums needed to measure up against everything else that we included in the book.
That's very cool. That's a good approach. And another aspect of the book that I really liked, because it wasn't something I was thinking about going into the book, is that there's a number of albums in here that aren't from a specific artist. They're compilations from like soundtracks or even tribute albums. You have the anthology of American folk music. Things that might not be people's first thoughts for essential. You know, tracking that stuff down. I mean, like, can you talk a little bit about the importance of including stuff like that in a compilation like this?
Yeah, I mean, they all made some very important mark in the decade and all and are essential listening. So many of the soundtracks, whether it's singles or Hope Floats or New Jack Swing, New Jack City. They help define those genres and frame their historical place, in the 90s and in music in general. The tribute albums, the Rocky Erickson one, Eye of the Pyramid. Who heard of Rocky Erickson before that? That made him the landmark artist he deserved to be. And there are several others. So, they were just important / essential albums to what music was in the 90s. And some of those tribute albums, they launched the tribute album, movement. Now these tribute albums are a dime a dozen.
Oh,
anymore. But in the 90s, they weren't. And when you had a guy like Hal Wilner putting these very interesting collections together, creating historical context for perhaps unappreciated or overlooked artists or genres of music, that was very important to our musical history.
Yeah. Well, and then you had Common Thread that got the Eagles their reunion started, which is I'll ask about the Eagles in a second here, but I have a submitted question from a friend of the show, a fellow podcaster named Brian, who hosts the My Weekly Mixtape podcast, which is a great
Hi, Brian.
And he asks, given how vast the decade was outside of the Billboard Hot 100, what would you say was the overarching musical theme of the 90s? Big concept question.
it is, and it's a good question. And basically, everything, including the kitchen sink, was the theme of the 90s. You saw genres and subgenres exploding left and right. We went from the hair metal into the grunge and then thrash metal coming up. We figured out how the country rock was really Americana. You had the rise of West Coast rap that East Coast rap then answered. EDM really started exploding, during that time, and a lot of it had roots in the 80s and even before that. But it seemed there were so many music consumers and so many avenues to consume music that everything just exploded in the 90s. And I do call this the last golden decade of the album, because by the time we got to the end of the 90s, we had Napster and we had file sharing and P2P and the beginnings of the streaming world that very shockingly quickly, turned the album on its ear. And we don't consume music primarily as albums anymore.
Yeah.
And that did happen very quickly after all that happened. But in the 90s, the number one album on the Billboard Hot 100 was selling 500,000, 800,000, 1 million copies a week. And we talked about albums as albums. And we were into the deep tracks. And, that really was the focal point on how we consume music. And that's changed.
Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned that, the next book in the series is the 80s and the 70s and so on. Do you think that a project like this, given what you just said about how our relationship with albums changed in the 2000s, do you think you could you could do a book about the 2000s, and would that 501 kind of measure up to the 90s 501 as far as influence?
That'll be very influencing. We absolutely could do,
Yeah,
that during the 2000s, even the 2010s.
yeah.
We could do it. Some of it will be discovery for people like, oh, you mean Olivia Rodrigo had an album? Or Taylor Swift had an album. Taylor's a bad example because
Sure.
she's the rare artist who has continued to be an album artist. But we will probably be surprising people that there's more depth to these artists that they love because of their individual songs.
Yeah.
And I do want to get to the 70s and hopefully the 60s before that, but I do look forward to the challenge of the 21st century and digging in and saying, kind of rubbing our hands and saying, okay, yeah, there were all these good albums that came out. Let's turn people on to these.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, well, I want to ask you a couple of questions about some of the entries that you wrote in this book, specifically the classic rock ones, because this channel is mostly about classic rock. And I want to start with one we touched on briefly about the Eagles and their reunion with Hell Freezes Over. That is an excellent album. I do love that one. But to me, it represents more than just the music that's on it. Tell me if I'm off base here,
No.
but to me, that represents the quintessential example of a band that broke up as a band and then returned as more of a brand. And that's kind of how they exist, and they set the template for that. Is that the flashpoint for that dynamic, or am I off base?
No, I couldn't have put it better. That's
Oh.
exactly why it's in the book.
Yeah.
Is because it not only brought back a very important band, but as you said, it launched this concept for how you can bring a band back, and you use the term brand, and very much so. It became, the Eagles have recorded since then. The Eagles recorded one album
Yeah. Yeah.
of new material, but tour like crazy and get big money. They're doing big business in Vegas right now at Sphere, and yeah, and they were the first to do it that way, but not the last. And a lot of other artists have followed that kind of model. It was really the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac with the dance.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah.
And interestingly, both coming out of the same management stable and and record conglomerate.
Yeah.
But no, that really created a kind of template for something that continued. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That's why, otherwise that would have been one of those very good albums, but not necessarily essential albums. But it had another piece to the story that
Yeah.
makes it essential to understand music in the 90s.
Absolutely. Oh, cool. I'm glad I'm glad to hear you say that, because yeah, I feel like the album is culturally relevant because it's like a hits compilation, or not a compilation, but it's a hits live show, with a few new tracks. But you're right, it leaves an impact. Okay, well let me move on to another one that you wrote about. Is another album I love, Meatloaf's "Bad Outta Hell 2." Talking about comebacks. Do you think that the 80s was a particularly friendly decade to legacy artists, but Meatloaf didn't really enjoy much of that?
Right.
Is he the most odd or unexpected comeback of the 90s?
Yeah, it was a surprise.
Yeah.
We meaning I think the music world in general, but certainly the critical cognoscenti had never expected to see a hit Meatloaf album again. But he did the right, he did the right thing. He got back together with Jim Steinman. Lightning struck twice. It would not strike a third time. I don't think you'll see Bad Out of Three in the, I think that was 2000s. It might have been the 2010s, but I don't think you'll see that album in that book. But Bad Out of Hell 2 captured the magic that was Bad Out of Hell 1, but also managed. It didn't sound like the same writer or the same guy singing the original Bad Out of Hell. It left room for that character to become an adult. And, so you felt like, yeah, that's that guy singing 20 years later.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and it scored the big hit, the
Yeah,
Michael Bay music video.
yeah. And it had other good songs. I mean, it really was a good album, and
Yeah.
it allowed Meatloaf to perpetuate a good career.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Uh, One I definitely got to give a shout out is that I'm so happy to see included here because I kind of suspected maybe I'm wrong on this, but I was surprised to see it was John Fogerty's Blue Moon Swamp,
Hmm.
which is a record I love, but he had such a big comeback in the 80s that I feel like maybe his comeback in the 90s is overshadowed by that. But, reading more about him, it seems like that's the album where he got right, if you will,
Right.
because he seemed to have some internal struggles about the music he was creating up until that point. So,
Well,
I mean, it's,
it wasn't so much the music he was creating, it was the music he had created
yeah,
that was dogging him. Blue Moon Swamp, one of the reasons it's in there is that's where he re-embraced Creedence Clearwater Revival, John Fogerty, both in sound, but that was also the tour when he went back on the road. He started playing the Creedence stuff again after having this mental block about it because of the legalities and the ownership of it and everything. So, I felt that was a very important moment in his career and a very important moment for music in general because it brought back one of our most important artists and creators. It brought him back to, as you put it, it got right.
yeah. I've seen him, I want to say 4 or 5 times in like the last less than 10 years. And they're some of the best shows I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And it blows my mind and honestly makes me kind of sad that he had such a struggle with his best work, some of his best work at least, up until all the way 97. I mean, that seems like a really long time, to wrestle with it. And it's a good album even separate from that.
Oh yeah, no,
Um,
it's great. And that's, one thing I hope is becoming clear in our conversation is the context of these albums. The impact was taken into account as much as the sounds on them. I mean, listen, if it weren't for impact, you wouldn't have Britney Spears in this book,
oh
or you
yeah,
wouldn't have In Sync or so many of the others. But the context of their place in the 90s made those records essential to the decade. Damn it.
yeah. Because you could make a list of however many albums in a vacuum on the internet, it doesn't mean anything. But to put it in a book, like that, the context, that's what gives it that the weight.
Right.
That's why it should be in that collection. Okay, the last one you wrote about that I want to ask about because this one also caught me off guard a little bit, but it was, I think, probably because of the greater context, but maybe you can expand on it. Trans-Siberian Orchestra,
Mhm.
Christmas Eve and Other Stories.
Yeah.
Uh, they have, are they a band that is such, like, so formulaic? Like, they have a thing that they do that is so specific. Do people forget that they exist outside of that one tour they do every year? Like, I like that album and I like their music, but I feel they've been kind of eaten by Christmas advertising and their very limited touring. And can you talk a little bit about why it was important that they be included in this list?
Yeah. Well, I think, part of what you just said is they have created such a legacy. And yes, a very limited legacy, and that's their own damn fault.
Yeah.
There are other albums they could tour on that are not Christmas. There are other albums that Paul O'Neill composed that they have chosen to not yet complete. So they've made that choice, and listen, they're laughing all the way to the bank with that choice. But this album was the one that launched it all. They are an empire and
Yeah.
a very formidable one. They're an important part of the annual music calendar, that tour and Trans-Siberian Orchestra. So that album and the album that began it all, is an essential piece of work for what came after. And it's also, if you're a prog rock head, it's it really is a good album.
Okay, that's great. I apologize. My
No,
kid.
don't apologize. We like our furry friends
Oh
around
boy,
here.
she might have to stay. She can be a little.
Yeah, it's fine. It's
Okay.
not doesn't bother me at all.
All right.
It's the
Thanks for
black
being.
cat crossing your path, not mine.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Glad we're past Halloween. Okay. Well, the last question about the '90s book is more about the upcoming '80s book because I'm already very excited for
Yeah,
that. I've got it on my wish list on Amazon. I've seen it's
thank you.
listed there. Uh, the '80s is such a big decade, but it doesn't have the same explosion of subgenres that the '90s does. So does that make writing that book more difficult, or is it easier to focus?
What made it most difficult to write is, and this will be the case in the 70s as well, is in the 80s you still had very significant bands releasing very significant albums almost every damn year. So figuring out, I mean, REM, Prince, I should know more of this off the top of my head, but you had Motley Crue, Talking Heads, Elvis Costello, and these were great albums every year, like
Yeah.
essential caliber albums. So compiling that list, and by the way, that book is done. I mean, I'm saying one of the tabs on my computer is the draft design
Oh,
of that book. But so yeah, making that list was tougher, even though there wasn't as much hip hop, although there was, and we get into it in the second half of the decade, or electronic music, although there was some that we also get into. But even though there was more in the kind of straight ahead, pop, rock, R&B type of world, there were a lot of them.
yeah.
And so, just drilling down into that was a lot of pacing and a lot of more arguments at the concerts between acts, and really having to gut that one out. So that's a book that'll cause even more arguments, I think, than the '90s book did. The '90s, the record industry had embraced the idea, the machine that was the record industry had embraced the idea of here's how you do a campaign, and it's more spaced out, and we don't need the artist to produce an album every year. In the '80s, they were still banging them out.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Well, I'll tell you, I'm very excited for that one already. So I hope you'll come back and visit us for that.
Oh, without a doubt.
That I think will be a treat. Glad to hear that you're also, looking to go even further back to the '60s and '70s.
Yeah,
Because that's
the
I
60s,
imagine it gets harder as you go further back, though.
the 60s is the furthest we'd go back
Yeah.
because that's the decade the albums became a thing. Not that there weren't significant albums before that, but certainly it was a less prominent art form. And even in the 60s, the first 3 years or so of the 60s, maybe four, and it was a different kind of thing. The important albums were by the jazz artists and the crooners and the Broadway cast albums and the soundtracks that were film scores more than
Oh,
soundtrack albums. But yeah, so there, we'll certainly be able to fill a book. But yeah, once you get to 64, 65 and all of that, then it becomes like, what Beatles album are you going to leave out of a 60s book?
right.
So yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Well, very cool. Okay, well, now I would like to pivot to a book that you published originally quite a while ago now, Traveling Man, which you wrote with Tom Weschler. Like I said, I got this book at the Detroit Historical Museum, which was very cool. Tom's photos are all over that exhibit, and they're awesome. So take me a little bit back to the writing of this book. What inspired you guys to put this one out?
I'll take credit for this one as my idea. My
Okay.
idea. Tom is a friend. I've known him for years. Our couple of our youngest kids went to school together, even, and he did a gallery exhibit of his photos in general. He had he has photos from the legendary Grandy Ballroom
Yeah.
and things like that. And the thing I told him at the end of it, I said, Tom, the photos are great, but next time let me write your captions that you include on the photos. But that started the discussion of, I think you got a book in here.
Yeah.
And we looked through his whole collection. We came up with a bunch of ideas, but it kept coming around to, the best stuff you have is Bob Seger, because he was Seger's tour manager for a while and kind of personal assistant and aide de camp and photographer. And he had this great collection of, as you see in the book, very intimate personal photos of Bob. In addition, it just wasn't the photos of Bob Seger on the on stage. You have him bare-chested playing acoustic guitar in the recording studio. You have him with his cars or just hanging out and things like that. And then you did have very rare concert photos, like playing the opening of one of our suburban malls here.
Oh, yeah.
And things like that, or being on TV. So we finally said, and because he was part of the Seger camp, he was a little bit concerned about doing that. But we finally decided, let's get it out. We don't need permission. You own these photos. Let's go for it. And so I put us together and I conceived the layout and how the book would go. It is Tom's memories that, I interviewed him, throughout and created this. And then we, went to Wayne State University Press here, which I thought would be interested in doing it. And they were. Very, very much so. And we just went from there. And, it's the Wayne State Press's biggest non-textbook seller of all time. There wasn't anything out about Seger. That was the other motivation. And when we did talk to Seger's management and such, one of the things I pointed out to him was, wouldn't you want the first book about Bob Seger to come from a friendly situation rather than just have somebody come in and write a book?
Yeah, no kidding. That is kind of my first thought about seeing that book. It dawned on me. I have a bookshelf here full of rock biographies and memoirs and all that stuff. And it boggles my mind that an artist at the stature of Bob Seger, I don't think there is like a full biography out there about him.
There's one that I know of that was completely third party.
Okay.
No original source material. And they're just not interested, the Seger camp.
Yeah.
They've been approached many times. People call me all the time. How do I get a hold of these guys to do it? And it's like, here you go, good luck.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, it's not something they're interested in. Bob's certainly a good enough writer. I think he could do it with just a good editor, without a ghostwriter.
Sure.
Or a partner, writer. He could probably do it himself, but for whatever reason, and there's a lot of things in Seger world that they haven't been interested in that other artists are routinely interested in. Like, where's the Bob Seger box set?
Yeah.
Where was the Bob Seger MTV Unplugged? That type of thing. Just not with their you got to respect that it's not what they want to do.
Yeah.
So they haven't.
And he was slow to get his music on streaming too, wasn't he?
Slow on streaming, slow on making music videos. He is a classic rock artist with a capital C and a capital R. They play arena concerts. They make albums, they still deal with, they up to the very end, they dealt with radio. Rock radio is the most important vehicle for them to promote themselves. That's where they are. That's their lane. And they stayed in it all the way until he stopped.
Well, I gotta hand it. You gotta hand it to him for the consistency, at least. But...
And the honesty and the authenticity.
Yeah.
He, Bob Seger is Bob Seger's authentic self, and was all the way through. And even though the people who do, love him and love the music and would want him to have become Bruce Springsteen or Post Malone, or Zach Clark, not Zach Clark, Zach Bryan. It's not what they wanted to do.
Does this have connections to or an explanation of why so much of the music that is cataloged in this book didn't really make the jump to CDs, because I know there was the early Seger a compilation that came out in 2009, but like when I read about these albums, a lot of them never made it past vinyl for a while.
Well, for a while, they got him out, and most of his catalog is available, save for
Okay.
those three Warner Brothers records he did. And I don't know exactly what the contractual morass behind those are, and I know he's not necessarily fond of all of them.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, but they should, as a matter of record, they should still come out.
Yeah.
People should have them. And listen, this guy, when we talked about no box set, Bob Seger is like the guy they invented the box set for. He's
Yeah.
got so much in his vaults and good material. Yeah, really good stuff. It's a shame that it's just sitting there. And I don't know if it's going to take selling it to, a BMG or one of the other catalog companies, for a third party to get in and say, look, this is good stuff. It's got to come out,
Yeah.
or what it's going to take. But it is what it is, and we certainly here on Ground Zero in Detroit, we accept that that's the will of Bob Seger.
Yep, fair enough. Oh, okay, well, let me ask you a question about one song that's somewhere in that archive that I'm sure no one's really clamoring for and isn't like maybe good per se, but you're the only person I can think of that I can even ask about this song because I couldn't find any information about it. Uh, I found a song called Ballad of the Yellow Beret
Yep.
that Bob sang on.
Fearless cowards of the USA, bravely here at home they stay. They watch their friends get shipped away. The draft dodgers of the Yellow Beret.
Kind of funny, but it seems to fly totally in the face of what his actual politics are. Do you know anything about that song, or what was the deal?
I mean, it was just a song. It was kind of a goof.
Yeah.
It was written during the in the 60s, during the Vietnam, I think it's 60s, if not early 70s, during the Vietnam War. And it's a bit of a, it's a bit of an honest song, and it's a bit of a parody, making fun, obviously, of the draft dodgers, and,
Right.
those who don't want to serve. But you can read that song, like a few different ways. Like I said, it could be a parody. You could be viewed as a parody, or just a goof. But it was very topical to what was around for a while, and that's one I'd be very surprised if we ever saw get a wide release, and partly because it was very much of its time. I think if, God forbid, the draft was ever reinstated, it would have a moment again. But it's, but it was of its time back then.
Yeah, and then he follows it up a couple of years later with 2 + 2 =
Right.
question mark, which is a total reverse of that. Yeah, I found that song, and it did make me laugh, but it did make me think, like, it must have been some sort of joke that was
Kind of like
a
a
social circle.
like I say, parody.
Yeah. Moving forward a couple of decades, let's zoom up to the decade you wrote about recently. I did notice, of course, that Bob is not included in this edition. So, I think we would agree that his 90s output wouldn't necessarily be essential for his catalog, let alone the 90s, like you said. But how would you describe what Bob was doing in the 90s?
Bob was more interested, I think, in the 90s in, exploring a little bit. I think there was a period in the 90s, because he was gone. He was out of sight,
Yeah.
For big gaps in the 90s. And I think he kind of lost a little interest. I really do. He was looking to settle down a little more, maybe, start a family, and just, he didn't have the same drive that he had back in the 70s and into maybe, say, the mid 80s. This is a guy who, 200 plus shows a year for a great many years, and he burned it real hard.
Yeah.
He kept writing, he remained creative, but he didn't feel like playing the game.
Yeah. Uh, another question that I bet you don't have a specific number for, but how many times have you seen Bob in concert?
Somewhere in the 40s,
Or oh wow, okay. So
maybe in the
going back, maybe a better question is, going back how long?
Going back to the Against the Wind tour. I was actually working did a summer with a concert promoter in Pittsburgh, and which is where I grew up, and we had two nights, two Seger shows at our big arena. So, the first time I saw him and blown away.
Yeah.
I mean, just a tremendous, tremendous show. And then, of course, when I arrived in Detroit working, as a music journalist at the daily paper, was when The Distance came out. And at that point, it was, it's been 2 years.
Oh.
Little did we know what we
Yeah.
were in store for, but that was a big gap. And also, that's when I first got to meet and interview him and start to really write about him.
Wow. I saw him probably 4 times across the last decade of him touring. Some of the best shows I've ever seen. Had a lot of fun at all those, but it did make me think, like, as I feel with every classic rock show I go to, like, it would have been amazing to see them back in their prime. When you think back to all the Bob shows you've seen, what are some of your favorite memories of seeing him on stage?
I mean, that first one and that was still the long-haired Bob Seger, and they were still playing a lot of the older catalog at that point. So, that was like getting, Live Bullet mix. Well, it's on the, it's on the Nine Tonight live album, but that, there was that. There was seeing him for the first time in Detroit at Cobo Arena, where they recorded Live Bullet and parts of Nine Tonight, and they refer to as the house that Bob built. And, that was just a moment. I felt like I was getting a little bit of Detroit history in that. He did a show for, one of the tours, was at Pine Knob, the outdoor venue here, our Alpine Valley. There was just something in the air at that show when he hit the stage, and the roar from the crowd, let you know you were really here in a special moment. And so many of the other shows that have specific memories to them were more like personal circumstances. Like the last time I saw him was on the last tour, and he played back in Pittsburgh, and we went to see that. So to see him for the last time back in the place where I saw him for the first time, it was special. And by some circumstances, we were in a box with one of the Pittsburgh Steelers owners, and Franco Harris comes walking into the box. So the last time I saw Bob Seger, in the place I saw Bob Seger the first time, with Franco freaking Harris next to me, was so that was a special memory that has a little to do with Bob, but a lot to do with some other things.
Well, that is freaking awesome. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Alpine Valley, because I don't know if you know this, but there's a fairly famous Bob Seger concert at Alpine Valley here that I've heard on our radio station from time to time as mentioned as like one of the best ever Milwaukee area concerts. I think it was like 87, Alpine Valley in 87. And I've looked for bootlegs, but I can't find it. But that always pops in my mind as like, he must have been he was obviously a great live act. So, okay, my last Bob Seger question for you before we get out of here is, obviously he's got these iconic big hit records in the late 70s, early 80s. What would you point? Where would you point someone who wants just to go a little bit deeper into his catalog, maybe some stuff that's a little overlooked? What do you think is his best stuff that's underrated?
I mean, you always, even though it was a big hit album, I would still turn people on to Live Bullet, because he was also still playing some of the deeper material. The problem with sending people back to the early Bob Seger albums is they don't sound particularly good. It wasn't really until Night Moves that they started to sound like not just contemporary albums, but timeless albums. And so while there are some interesting songs before that, just the albums don't really hold up sonically.
Yeah.
like they should. But I would give somebody Live Bullet.
Yeah.
So to hear some of that stuff, I give somebody Night Moves, because there were a lot of songs on Night Moves that did not make it, and some of that, I mean, I do like some of the later albums. Yeah, I think there was some good material on them. The Distance, I got to tell you, The Distance is my favorite Bob Seger album.
Oh, nice.
It came from a very interesting place, and the story behind some of those songs, were really, really interesting. He had clearly, in that 2 years, what do you mean 2 years between albums, that he took off, he had really very clearly lived a life.
Yeah.
And he put them into some very rich songs. And, Ride Out, I thought in 2014, I thought that was a pretty good album too.
Oh, that one knocked me out. I was surprised by that one. I love
Yeah.
the song that's the Hey Gypsy, a tribute to Stevie Ray Vaughan.
Yep.
I that one knocked me out when I saw it in concert. Okay, I forgot to ask you this before.
Sure.
Yes or no, did Chevy ruin Like a Rock?
Chevy, the most dependable, longest lasting trucks on the road.
No. Okay. I think for a minute people were upset about it, but then when you start to think about it, okay, if Bob Seger's going to license a song to anybody, shouldn't it be a Detroit car company?
Oh, yeah. No,
first an American automotive company and then a Detroit one. Yeah, I mean, I think that was more a matter of the timing. We were still a little sketchy about hearing Robert Plant sing about Coca-Cola and Steve Winwood, and Genesis do Michelob, and Eric Clapton, a recovered alcoholic. It was still kind of a sketchy time. Now we wouldn't blink an eye.
Right.
I mean, if anything, you'd say, geez, Bob should have done with that ad what Springsteen did with the Jeep commercial.
Oh.
He should have turned it into basically a music video.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's funny. Well, excellent. Gary, I got to tell you, man, talking 90s and talking Bob Seger has been absolutely a blast with you. In the last couple of weeks, I've been catching your segments on Bob and Brian, and it's a nice reminder of, I haven't listened to them in a while, but I need to keep listening to your segments because it's always a treat. So thanks so much for coming by. This was a joy to speak with you, and I really hope you'll come back for the 80s one.
You can count on it, and thank you. I've really enjoyed the discussion.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for listening. There's no shortage of great content out there, so you choosing to spend some time listening to this show means quite a lot. If you're so inclined, please give this podcast a 5-star rating and a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. And share our links wherever you can. Or mention this show to anyone you know looking for a podcast recommendation. All of this helps us out a great deal, and I appreciate it. You can connect with us on social media too. We are at Play That Podcast on Facebook, Threads, Blue Sky, and even TikTok. Or we are at Play That Rock and Roll on YouTube and Instagram. Please post a comment and say hello. Finally, Play That Rock and Roll is a proud member of the Pantheon podcast community. So if you're looking for more music podcasts beyond this one, trust me, start with Pantheon. You won't be disappointed. Otherwise, I appreciate any and all efforts you take to support us here at Play That Rock and Roll. Be sure to join us next time for more great music and stories from the world of classic rock.